Although several concerns face the game of Magic the Gathering, such as paper quality in the physical card game or the printing of particularly poor design cards like Smuggler's Copter and Collected Company in recent memory, the largest mechanical issue in Magic the Gathering has existed since the beginning of the game. Lands in the main deck arbitrarily disadvantage players. Stuart Ashens detailed a list of fundamental flaws which destroy player enjoyment in a video game. The first flaw is, quote, zero control over win stroke loss status, which describes the arbitrary nature of the outcome of the game, with lack of consideration of players' skill or strategy. One of the major causes of human stress is the feeling of having no control over your life. To describe the degree of the flaw as fundamentally game-breaking or even a cause of stress in so much as a frustration and a barrier to the game gaining competitive weight is an overreaction. Starting with a disadvantage due to no player actions or choices is more than just a petty niggle, as it can very quickly compound into a comedy of rapidly escalating disadvantages. Taking mulligan after mulligan as your hand size dwindles in hopes of drawing vital lands, the flaw of lands in the main deck is deeply ingrained, affecting players in every tier and format within Magic, but enough waxing about the minor flaw in the design leading to a widespread unraveling. Time for a bit of statistics to support my assertion. Most players have experienced mana droughts, when too few lands are drawn, or mana floods, when too many lands are drawn. Both are symptomatic of the inclusion of the resource card in the main deck, but anecdotes are among the weakest forms of evidence. Instead, a hypergeometric calculator may be employed in order to simulate trillions of potential hands drawn to see the aggregate view of the distribution of lands in the opening 7 cards. Going into details about the combinatorics involved in the hypergeometric formula would probably be alienating and detract from the point being made. But hopefully pie charts are familiar enough to describe the relation between the number of lands in the main deck and the probability of drawing the correct number of lands in the opening hand. The average mana cost of different strategies changes the ideal number of lands in the opening hand, as lower curve decks need fewer lands, while slower, more control-based strategies generally play higher mana cost cards. For this example, the ideal number of mana sources in the opening hand will be set to 2 lands. Conventional wisdom is to generally play at least 20 lands, resulting in roughly a 30% chance of drawing exactly 2 lands, decreasing to about 25% chance with 24 lands in the main deck. Although the odds of drawing insufficient lands decreases as the number of lands in the main deck increases, the chance of drawing too many lands also increases. This is the crux of the paradox, or threading the mana needle, simultaneously minimizing the risk of mana flood and mana drought. So where is the sweet spot? Where is the likelihood of drawing sufficient mana greatest? The hypothetical is probably the wrong question to ask, as occasionally keeping a hand with 1 mana source and a low average cost hand may be better than losing a card in an effort to try to draw a better hand. A better question would probably be how to maximize the probability of drawing between 1 and 3 mana sources inclusively. At 20 lands, the probability of drawing either 1, 2, or 3 lands is 79.2%, with 4.8% chance of drawing 0 lands and a 16% chance of drawing more than 3 lands. Increasing the number of lands beyond 20 decreases the probability of drawing less than 2 lands from 24.7% to 14.3%, but at the cost of increasing the chance of drawing in excess of 3 lands, rising from 15.9% to 27.9%. while the chance of drawing either 2 or 3 lands is relatively unchanged. Not only does the inconsistency of the opening hands cause the results of the game to be more arbitrary, it also opens up an opportunity for an unfair advantage. Paper shuffling is always a problem, as true randomization is very difficult to accomplish, especially so in a timely manner or in a tournament setting. But the prevalence of a particular manner of cheating has become a phenomenon. Mana weaving, a derivative of deck stacking, mana sources are deliberately placed into the deck with regular frequency. Subtle, efficient, difficult to detect, this method of cheating is incredibly insidious, as unlike stacking a particular card, mana sources are plentiful and may even be distributed into the deck directly from the lands collected from the battlefield at the end of the game. Mana weaving is a blight on the competitive game, and a direct result of resource cards being integrated into the main deck. The ubiquity of the flaw is perhaps the worst facet of the inconsistent mana problem, as all level of play are affected. The effect, however, is especially hard on newer players, when a random loss due to no fault of the player can dramatically increase the probability of churn, and in some cases, single-handedly cause players to leave the game. But the game was not always like this. The problem used to be much worse, as Mulligan rules for Magic had two dramatic shifts in history. The first being a fundamental alteration allowing for greater player choice. In the beginning, players could only mulligan hands under three conditions. 1. The player's hand is composed entirely of lands. 2. The player's hand contains no lands. And 3. The opponent has taken a mulligan. Problem is fairly clear, as only the most problematic hands could be discarded in the hopes for better mana distribution. More recently, another development to combat the inherent inconsistency has been the Vancouver Mulligan, which allows any player who keeps fewer than the opening hand size the ability to scry 1. Although a few marginal improvements centered around the mulligan have emerged, I think that a larger overhaul of Magic is required to solve this issue. My solution is the creation of a second deck, composed entirely of lands, perhaps to be named the Land Deck. Although proper game balance is not the emphasis of this thought experiment, I think entertaining the notion of a second deck could increase a player's feeling of agency and control, as well as allow for new and varied strategies to emerge. Such a radical change seems more akin to Yu-Gi-Oh! Perhaps, with the extra deck being a distinct entity accessed through specific means. But precedent actually exists in Magic. The enchantment Endless Horizons exiles any number of planes, then allows the player to effectively draw one per turn, in addition to the turn player's normal draw. White has always had the mechanic of drawing lands from the deck, with the quintessential example being land tax. But I think the mechanics should not be color locked. Similarly, the contraption deck in the unstable set is an indication that the consistency of the deck is not worth sacrificing even in a less serious set. On a conceptual level, the inclusion of lands in the main deck is debatable. In Magic, the Planeswalker forms bonds with the surrounding lands to borrow their energy. Although summoning creatures, casting spells, enchantments, and even magical equipment feel at home in the library,
Huge tracts of land
never felt right to be included in the main deck. Instead, an excursion to a new area being represented by drawing a land from the land deck would fit better than occasionally stumbling upon one while perusing tomes of arcane lore and ethereal wisdom. Flavorfully, the land deck seems to be an improvement. Mechanically, the land deck would operate the same as the main deck, with the player's ability to choose which deck to draw from whenever cards would be drawn or even milled. On surface level interpretation, this seems like it would disproportionately favor tempo or aggression-based strategies in which excess lands serve no purpose. But the access to more consistent mana also allows for control decks to have better counterplay options like mass balance or board wipes, even with the option to forego drawing main deck cards in favor of necessary lands. Implementation of a land deck does little to alleviate a related issue, as guaranteeing lands does not mean that the right mana sources will line up with the main deck cards. Although this is an inherent risk in any multicolor deck, and the benefit of drawing lands on demand might render this point moot. So what are the barriers for the implementation of the land deck? The opening hand size may have to be cut down to better represent the loss of the resource cards. Draw power, ramp, and the mana curve for minions might all have to be adjusted, since the sheer availability of exactly what is wanted in the moment allows all strategies a substantial increase in power levels. One potential ramification is that ramp strategies benefit from the change in an odd way. as only strategies when lands are played from the hand can really take advantage of the land deck, as lands which come into play directly from the deck would be unaffected, albeit more conveniently found than having to scour through the entire main deck. Implementation of a solution of this magnitude, however, necessitates a colossal shift in the way the game is played, and as a result, breaks some mechanics. Explore, for instance, becomes a choice to either buff the creature or to draw the land, rather than a gamble where the desired result is not always apparent. Additionally, landfall becomes a very dangerous keyword, as a guaranteed land draw every turn could trigger multiple instances of landfall each turn. Changes of this magnitude are a massive risk, as fundamental structure of the game might have to be relearned by players. But such a change is not unprecedented in card games. With the example of Yu-Gi-Oh!, with the implementation of Master Rule 4, which caused an enormous shift and even a divide in the player base. So what's the verdict? A disappointing wash, as the actual implementation is perhaps too unwieldy to see the light of day, with a cascading chain of consequences which may very well warp the metagame of Magic in all formats. The important part is the potential discussion gained through the exploration of the idea, as there likely exists a much better solution, although it might require some lateral thinking.